In the 1930s, the world stood between two great wars. Nations were rebuilding, and the idea of another global conflict felt distant, but some minds could already see the storm coming. While most believed war would be fought on the ground, a small group of visionaries in America looked to the sky. They dreamed of an aircraft unlike anything ever built before, a flying fortress, powerful enough to cross oceans, carry heavy bombs, and defend itself against anything the enemy could send. It began inside the Boeing Company's hangars in Seattle. Engineers studied metal frames, gun turrets, and engines that could endure the unimaginable. They weren't designing just another bomber. They were building a symbol of American strength and reach. The idea sounded impossible. A plane that could fly thousands of miles without fighter escort? Military officials laughed. Critics said it was too heavy, too expensive, too ambitious. But Boeing's engineers refused to back down. In 1935, the first prototype rolled out onto the runway, a sleek silver machine with 4 roaring engines and more guns than any bomber before it. When it took to the sky, the world noticed. It climbed faster, flew higher, and carried more firepower than anyone thought possible. Reporters watching from the ground were stunned. One of them called it a flying fortress. The name stuck. The dream was no longer just on paper. It was real, alive, and roaring through the clouds. No one knew it yet, but this machine, born from a dream in a quiet hangar, would soon become one of the most feared sights in the skies of World War II.
In the summer of 1935, at Boeing Field in Seattle, a single aircraft stood gleaming in the sun. It looked different, bigger, stronger, almost arrogant. Its name was simple, Model 299. To most, it was just another prototype, but to those who built it, it was the future. The plane was unlike anything the world had seen. 4 engines instead of 2, a sleek metal body, 5 machine guns pointing in every direction, a bomber that could defend itself. When the Model 299 took off for its first flight, it soared higher and faster than expected. Observers gasped as it climbed effortlessly over the horizon. The test pilot, Eddie Allen, described it as smooth, stable, and alive. For Boeing's engineers, it was proof that their impossible dream could work. Soon after, the U.S. Army called for a new long-range bomber. Boeing's Model 299 went head-to-head with other designs, smaller, cheaper, simpler. But when the tests began, there was no comparison. The 299 flew farther, faster, and carried 5 times more bombs. It was the clear winner. But fate had a cruel twist waiting. During a demonstration flight at Wright Field, tragedy struck. The plane stalled after takeoff and crashed, killing 2 crew members, including the pilot, Major Ploy Hill. The Army called it too much airplane for one man to handle. Contracts went instead to smaller bombers. The dream seemed over, but Boeing refused to let it die. Behind the scenes, engineers studied every detail of the crash. They created a simple but revolutionary solution, the pre-flight checklist, a tool that would save countless lives and change aviation forever. Though the Army didn't buy the Model 299, they couldn't ignore its power. They ordered a handful of test models and gave it a new name, B-17 Flying Fortress. The world didn't know it yet, but the plane born from a crash would soon rule the skies of war.
The name wasn't chosen in a meeting room. It wasn't the work of generals or engineers. It came from a single moment and a single man. In July 1935, as the Boeing Model 299 taxied across the airfield for its first demonstration, a journalist from the Seattle Times watched in awe. He saw the gleaming machine roll past, its sides bristling with machine guns. He scribbled 4 words that would echo through history. "It's a flying fortress." That headline changed everything. The name captured the imagination of the public, the military, and even America's rivals abroad. It sounded powerful, invincible, the kind of machine that didn't just fly into battle, it owned the sky. Boeing seized the phrase immediately. They painted the words "Flying Fortress" on the prototype's nose, right beneath the cockpit windows. In that moment, a legend was born. But the name was more than a title. It became a promise. The engineers knew the B-17 had to live up to its image. More armor, more guns, more power. Every version after the first was tougher, deadlier, and smarter. To the men who would one day fly them, the B-17 wasn't just a plane. It was a home in the sky. Its gun ports became their windows. Its engines became their heartbeat. Its wings, their only escape from death below. By the late 1930s, as Europe drifted toward war, the Flying Fortress stood ready, a steel guardian waiting for its moment. And soon, that moment would come. The fortress would leave American soil and enter a world on fire, a world where its name would become legend. In the late 1930s, while Boeing engineers believed they had built the future, Washington wasn't so sure. To the men in suits and uniforms, the Flying Fortress looked impressive, but it also looked expensive. Too many engines, too much fuel, too much risk. America wasn't ready for another war. The Great Depression had left the nation weary and cautious. Congress slashed defense budgets. Many generals still believed battles would be won with infantry, tanks, and artillery, not bombers flying thousands of miles away. Inside the Pentagon's early offices, heated debates filled the rooms. Some officers argued that the B-17 could strike any enemy before they reached American shores. Others called it a fantasy, a waste of money in a time of peace. Even within the Army Air Corps, faith was divided. A few visionaries, like General Henry Hap Arnold, saw the bomber's potential. They believed that air power could end wars before they began. But they were voices in a storm of doubt. Meanwhile, Europe was trembling. Hitler had taken power in Germany. Factories were roaring again, not to rebuild, but to rearm. Across the ocean, the Luftwaffe was rising from the ashes of the Great War. Reports reached Washington warning of what was coming, but the policymakers looked the other way. They said America would stay out of Europe's problems. They said oceans would protect them. They said there would be no need for a fortress in the sky. So the B-17 project slowed. Budgets were cut, orders reduced. For a while, it seemed the Flying Fortress would never leave American soil. But fate was already moving. The storm that Washington ignored was about to break. And when it did, they would remember the plane they doubted, the fortress they nearly abandoned. Factories slowed their work. Soldiers trained in dusty fields, not knowing if they'd ever see combat. And far from the headlines, a few B-17s sat in hangars, their silver wings gathering dust. The Flying Fortress had been built for a war that hadn't come yet. To most Americans, it was just another military project, an expensive one too. But to the men who had flown it, there was something different about this plane. They spoke of its power, its range, its ability to survive where others failed. They knew deep down that its time would come. Across the Atlantic, the world was already unraveling. Germany reoccupied the Rhineland. Italy invaded Ethiopia. Japan marched deeper into China. Each headline was another warning, but the warnings went unheard. In 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. Europe was once again at war. Britain and France called on their allies, and the skies over Europe began to fill with fire. In Washington, the tone shifted overnight. The same generals who once dismissed the B-17 now demanded more of them. Air bases across America came alive again. Engines roared, pilots trained, crews learned to work as one. Boeing restarted production, refining every part, making the fortress faster, tougher, deadlier. It was no longer just an experiment. It was becoming a weapon of purpose. Still, America stood on the sidelines, watching the world burn. The B-17 waited, its wings ready, its engines silent. But history was moving toward a moment no one could stop. And soon, a December morning in Pearl Harbor would turn that silence into thunder.
While America debated and delayed, Germany was already preparing for domination of the skies. From the moment Hitler came to power in 1933, his generals knew that the next war would not be won by trenches, it would be won by airplanes. In secret hangars across Germany, the old restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles were quietly ignored. Factories that once built cars began producing engines. Workshops turned out wings, fuselages, and machine guns. Piece by piece, a new air force was being born, the Luftwaffe. At its head stood Hermann Göring, a decorated pilot from the First World War and one of Hitler's most loyal men. He promised his Führer that no enemy bomber would ever reach German soil. His words became the pride of the Reich and a prophecy that would one day collapse in flames. By the late 1930s, the Luftwaffe had become the most advanced air force on Earth. It possessed hundreds of bombers, the Heinkel H-111, the Junkers U-88, and the fearsome Stuka dive bomber, whose screaming siren became the sound of terror. Fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 ruled the air, fast, agile, and deadly. When war began in 1939, the Luftwaffe struck first and struck hard. Poland's defenses crumbled under relentless bombing. Cities, bridges, and railways disappeared beneath waves of German aircraft. The skies belonged to the Reich. Over the next year, the Luftwaffe swept across Europe, Norway, France, the Netherlands, crushing anything that dared to rise against it. The world watched as the Nazi war machine seemed unstoppable. Göring boasted that Germany now had air supremacy. He called it the Iron Sky, and for a time, he was right. But far away, on the other side of the Atlantic, the flying fortress was awakening. A new kind of war was coming, one that would test the limits of courage, steel, and sky itself.
By 1940, Hitler's Luftwaffe was untouchable. It had swept through Europe with ruthless precision, an air force forged in arrogance and victory. In the eyes of Nazi Germany, the sky already belonged to them. The Luftwaffe squadrons had destroyed cities, crushed armies, and broken nations before they even knew what hit them. Every campaign began the same way. Waves of German aircraft appearing without warning, bombing defenses into dust before a single soldier could fight back. Inside the Reich's war rooms, the confidence was overwhelming. Generals pointed to maps covered in black arrows, each marking another swift victory. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, was adored by Hitler, the man who promised that not one enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin. To him, the German Air Force was invincible. They had reason to believe it. The Luftwaffe's pilots were the best trained in the world. Their aircraft were fast, efficient, and already proven in battle, in Spain, Poland, France, and over the English Channel. The Stukas screamed down like falling demons. The Messerschmitts sliced through the air with deadly precision. When Hitler turned his eyes toward Britain, Göring promised a quick victory. He said the Royal Air Force would be crushed in weeks. He called it the Battle of Britain, a test of the Luftwaffe's dominance. But something unexpected happened. For the first time, the Luftwaffe met an enemy it couldn't easily defeat. British pilots fought with desperate courage. Radar spotted attacks before they came, and Göring's bombers began falling faster than they could be replaced. It was the first crack in the armor, a tiny fracture in Hitler's illusion of invincibility. Still, the Nazi leadership refused to see it. They believed the Luftwaffe was unmatched, unchallenged, eternal. Even as American factories roared to life, even as the first B-17s rolled off the lines, the Germans mocked them as toys. Too big, too slow, too late. But the sky has no loyalty. And soon, the air Hitler thought he owned would fill with 1,000 silver wings. For years, America watched the world burn from a distance. Europe was at war. Nations fell one by one beneath the boots of the Nazi war machine. But across the ocean, the United States stayed silent, neutral, isolated, and hopeful that the storm would never reach its shores. Factories worked at half pace, air bases trained in peace, and the B-17 flying fortress, that great dream of power, sat waiting in the shadows. Then came December 7th, 1941. A quiet morning in Hawaii, broken by the thunder of engines and the scream of falling bombs. Japanese aircraft filled the sky over Pearl Harbor, tearing through ships and airfields in a storm of fire and steel. In 2 hours, America's illusion of safety vanished. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Congress and spoke 13 words that changed history, a date which will live in infamy. America was no longer an observer. It was at war. Factories that had been silent for years roared to life overnight. Men lined up to enlist. Women filled the assembly lines, and Boeing's engineers worked day and night, rolling out the first squadrons of B-17s destined for Europe. The flying fortress was no longer a dream or an experiment. It was a necessity. The Army Air Forces formed the 8th Air Force, soon to be the largest and most powerful air fleet the world had ever seen. Across the Atlantic, Britain was still standing, bloodied but unbroken, and from their airfields, American crews would soon take off into the heart of Nazi Germany. For many of those young men, it would be their first time leaving home. For some, it would be their last. The United States had entered the war, and the skies of Europe were about to become the deadliest battlefield of all.
The call to war had been answered. Now came the hardest part, getting there. In early 1942, hundreds of brand new B-17 flying fortresses lined up on American airfields, engines humming, crews nervous but proud. Their destination was across a vast ocean, to the bases of England, where a new front in the war was waiting to be born. But crossing the Atlantic in a bomber wasn't routine. It was a journey into the unknown. No GPS, no satellite guidance. Only compasses, maps, and the courage of young men barely out of training. The routes were dangerous. Storms tore through formations, freezing winds lashed the engines, and radio silence left pilots flying blind for hours. Some planes ran out of fuel and ditched in icy seas. Others vanished into the fog, never to be found. Those who made it saw a sight they would never forget: the misty green fields of England, dotted with air bases that would soon become home. To the British on the ground, the arrival of the American bombers was both a relief and a revelation. The sight of those silver wings meant hope and help. Crews stepped off their planes onto foreign soil for the first time. They were greeted not as strangers, but as brothers in arms. The pubs of small English villages filled with new voices, new accents, and laughter hiding quiet fear. They called it the friendly invasion. Thousands of young Americans filling the countryside, preparing for missions that would change the course of the war. From these fields, the Flying Fortress would take off toward occupied Europe. And from these same fields, many would never return. The Atlantic crossing was over. The waiting was done. The real war, the air war over Nazi Germany, was about to begin.
In the spring of 1942, the quiet airfields of eastern England began to transform. Runways stretched across farmland. Barracks, hangars, and control towers rose from the mud. And soon, the skies above would echo with the thunder of engines, the sound of America arriving in force. This was the birth of the 8th Air Force, a new kind of army, built not on tanks or trenches, but on wings and courage. It was more than just a unit. It was a city in the sky. Thousands of men poured in from across the United States. Pilots, gunners, navigators, mechanics, teenagers and farm boys, factory workers and college students. They came with one mission: to take the war straight to Hitler's heart. Each bomber crew became a family of 10. They trained together, ate together, and would one day fight and die together. They memorized every sound their fortress made: the hum of the engines, the rattle of the guns, the metallic heartbeat that became their rhythm of survival. The 8th Air Force was tasked with something no one had ever done before: daylight precision bombing, striking targets in Nazi Germany while the enemy could see them coming. It was bold, it was dangerous, and it had never been tried on such a scale. Commanders promised that the fortress could defend itself. Its 12 machine guns would protect it from any fighter. Its armor would keep its crew alive. At least that was the theory. In reality, the men knew the risks. They had seen what the Luftwaffe had done to Britain, and now they were preparing to face it themselves, in broad daylight, deep behind enemy lines. By late 1942, the 8th Air Force was ready. Hundreds of B-17s stood lined up on English runways, their crews climbing aboard, their engines roaring to life. Each one bore a name painted on its nose: Memphis Belle, Hell's Angels, Flying Flit Gun, 909, symbols of hope and defiance. The Fortress Army had formed. Its mission was clear, and soon the first waves of silver wings would rise over Europe to challenge the empire that believed the sky belonged only to them.
To the German High Command, news of the American bombers' arrival brought laughter, not fear. The Luftwaffe, masters of the European sky, had crushed every foe that dared to challenge them. Britain's Royal Air Force had barely survived the Blitz. Now the Americans, fresh,
inexperienced and untested, claimed they would bomb Germany in daylight. Daylight. To the Germans, that word was a joke. No one had ever flown into their defenses under the sun and lived to tell the tale. From Berlin to occupied France, Luftwaffe officers mocked the very idea. "Let them come," they said. "We'll shoot them down like pigeons." And on paper, they had every reason to be confident. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s ruled the skies. Their anti-aircraft guns, the dreaded Flak 88s, could tear through bombers at 5 miles high. The German fighter pilots were veterans, aces with dozens of kills. Their aircraft were fast, agile, and built for destruction. Against them stood the American B-17 Flying Fortress, slow, heavy, and carrying 10 young men who had never seen combat. The Luftwaffe called it a steel coffin with wings. German newspapers mocked the American strategy. Their propaganda reels showed fortresses bursting into flames, tumbling from the clouds, the announcer sneering, "The Reich welcomes America to Europe." But the Americans had something the Germans didn't expect: belief. They trusted their machines. They trusted their brothers in the sky. And above all, they trusted that no fortress would ever fly alone. They would rise not in 2s or 10s, but in hundreds, and soon in thousands. The laughter of the Luftwaffe was loud in 1942, but before long, that laughter would turn into silence and fear.
The morning sky over England was pale and still. Dozens of crews stood beside their bombers, staring up through the mist, waiting for the order that would make history. Their target? The rail yards and factories of occupied France, the first step towards striking the heart of the Reich. Engines thundered to life, propellers blurred, and one by one, the B-17 Flying Fortresses lifted off the runways of Britain, their silver wings gleaming in the cold light of dawn. It was August 17th, 1942, the first American daylight bombing mission over Nazi-occupied Europe. 12 bombers took off from Polbrook Airfield. Their objective? The railway marshalling yards at Rouen, a vital link in Germany's supply chain. As they crossed the English Channel, the crews felt the weight of history pressing down on them. The radio was silent. The sea below shimmered like glass. Every man in those planes knew the enemy was waiting. And then, from the horizon, came black puffs of smoke. Flak. The Germans had seen them. Explosions burst around the formations, shaking the planes, filling the cockpits with the smell of smoke and metal. But the fortresses held their course, steady and unwavering. The bombardiers peered through their sights, fingers poised. Bombs away. The first American bombs fell on Europe that morning, precise, devastating, and symbolic. Factories burned, rail lines shattered, and for the first time, the Nazi-occupied continent realized that a new power had entered the skies. The mission was a success. Every plane returned. No one believed it at first, not even their commanders. It was a beginning, small, almost quiet. But from that moment on, the Americans would come again and again, each time in greater numbers, each time deeper into enemy territory. The first missions over France proved one thing beyond doubt: the Flying Fortress could fight, and the daylight war over Europe had just begun.
The early missions had gone well, too well. The Americans believed the Flying Fortress could defend itself
12 guns, 10 men, and the promise that tight formations would make them unstoppable. But soon, the Luftwaffe came to prove otherwise. It began over the skies of France and the Low Countries. The radar screens in German control towers lit up, dozens of dots crossing the channel in broad daylight. The alarm sounded, engines roared to life, and within minutes, Messerschmitt B-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s were climbing to meet them. The first encounters were brutal. Out of the sun came the fighters, streaking down like hawks. Cannon shells ripped through aluminum skin, wings tore apart, engines burst into flame. The fortress crews fought back with everything they had, 50 caliber guns roaring from every angle, tracers stitching the sky. Inside the planes, the airmen shouted, bled, and fired until their barrels glowed red hot. A B-17 was no easy kill. Many took dozens of hits and still flew on. Wings shredded, engines dead, holes big enough to crawl through, but somehow they made it home. That's when the Germans learned to respect the fortress. A crippled B-17 could still fight, still shoot, still kill. And even when one went down, 5, 10, or 20 more filled its place. But the truth was hard. Losses were growing. Each mission brought back fewer planes, fewer faces. The self-defending bomber was powerful, but not invincible. The Luftwaffe adapted quickly. Head-on attacks, rocket strikes, and coordinated swarms tore into formations. The Americans had courage and steel, but what they lacked was protection. Long-range fighters that could stay with them all the way to the target and back. Until then, every crew that climbed into a B-17 knew the odds. They weren't just flying into enemy territory, they were flying into history. They called it the Flying Fortress, and soon that name would prove prophetic. Mission after mission, B-17s limped back to England looking more like ghosts than machines. Wings shredded, engines gone, windows shattered, but somehow still flying. Stories began to spread across the airfields. Tales of fortresses so torn apart they should have fallen from the sky, yet clawed their way home through sheer will and steel. One bomber returned with half a tail missing. Another had its nose blown completely off, the bombardier clinging to his harness in open air. There were planes with hundreds of bullet holes, control cables cut, and one engine after another sputtering out, and still they made it across the channel. Crewmen swore the fortress had a soul, that when everything else failed, when hydraulics were gone, when controls were frozen, when the pilot had nothing left, the plane itself would keep them alive. They patched the holes, replaced the engines, and sent her out again, and again, and again. The Germans began to notice. Pilots reported shooting at B-17s that refused to fall, calling them Fliegende Panzer, flying tanks. They hit them with everything, cannon shells, rockets, even ramming attacks. But still, many fortresses turned around and came home. Some crews joked that the B-17 didn't need wings to fly, it just needed heart. Others said it was luck. But for the men who lived it, it was more than that. It was faith in the machine, in each other, in the idea that if one engine kept spinning, they had a chance. Every returning fortress became a legend, and every scar on its fuselage was a medal, proof that no matter how fierce the Luftwaffe's attacks, the Flying Fortress refused to die.
By late 1942, the American dream of daylight precision bombing was in full swing. But it was built on a dangerous belief that the Flying Fortress could protect itself all the way to Germany and back without a single fighter escort. It was a theory that looked good on paper. In reality, it was suicide. At first, the targets were close. factories in France, shipyards in Holland, bases along the coast. But as the war deepened, the orders came to strike farther, deeper, into the industrial heart of the Reich: Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen, Berlin. Beyond the range of friendly fighters, beyond hope of rescue, the bombers took off in great shining formations, hundreds of fortresses filling the sky like a silver river. But once they crossed the German border, the trap was always waiting. The Luftwaffe pounced. Waves of Bf-109s and Fw-190s dove straight into the formations, cannons blazing. Bombers exploded mid-air. Flaming wrecks spiraled down through the clouds. Gunners fought back with every gun they had, but there were too many enemies, too far from home. The raids became nightmares. Long hours of flak and fire, of friends vanishing into smoke. Entire squadrons were wiped out before reaching their targets. Some crews flew missions knowing they had less than a 50% chance of coming home. The lesson was written in blood and metal. The fortress was mighty, but it could not stand alone. Commanders had to face the truth. If the air war was to continue, they needed a guardian, a fighter that could fly with the bombers all the way to Germany and back. But in 1943, that plane did not yet exist. So the B-17 crews kept flying, unescorted, outnumbered, and unbroken. They flew on faith, courage, and the hope that somehow one more mission might turn the tide.
Back home, across the Atlantic, a miracle was happening. One built not of faith, but of industry. The United States had awakened. Every factory, every foundry, every assembly line had joined the war. From Detroit to Seattle, the air echoed with the pounding of rivets and the roar of engines. America wasn't just building bombers, it was building an air armada. At Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed, workers turned out B-17s by the hour. Each one took nearly 75,000 parts. Each rivet, wire, and bolt a small promise to the men who would fly it. Women flooded the factories, their hands steady and proud, shaping the wings that would carry their brothers and sons into battle. Rosie the Riveter became the face of a nation at war. Train cars carried engines across the continent. Convoys rolled through the night with crates marked U.S. Army Air Forces. Every day, new bombers rose from the runways, silver giants bound for the skies of Europe. The scale was staggering. In 1943 alone, America produced over 8,000 B-17s, a flood of metal that no empire could match. They called it the arsenal of democracy. But it wasn't just machines that were multiplying, it was men. Thousands of airmen trained in Texas, California, and Florida. They learned to shoot, navigate, and trust their crews like family. By the time they reached England, they were soldiers of the air, young, fearless, and ready to die for a world they hadn't yet seen. Back in Europe, German commanders stared at the sky in disbelief. For every fortress they shot down, 10 more seemed to appear. No matter how many they destroyed, the formations kept coming, larger, stronger, endless. The Luftwaffe began to realize the truth. They weren't fighting an air force anymore. They were fighting an industry, a nation, and an idea too vast to stop. The air armada was rising, and soon it would darken the skies over Germany itself.
While men soared through the skies over Europe, another army fought the war on the ground. An army without rifles, without medals, and without glory. They were the women of America, and their battlefield was the factory floor. When the call to arms came, millions of men left for war.
Their absence left empty machine shops, silent hangars, and deserted production lines. But the nation could not stop. The skies depended on them. So women stepped forward. Housewives, teachers, waitresses, and farmhands traded aprons for welding masks. Their hands, once soft from home life, grew calloused and strong, steady enough to rivet steel and build wings that would cross oceans. They worked in shifts, around the clock, building B-17s, B-24s, and every part of the air armada. Each bolt, each rivet was a heartbeat of hope sent to sons, husbands, and brothers fighting far away. They became legends, immortalized by a single symbol: Rosie the Riveter. Sleeves rolled up, jaw set in determination. The poster said, "We can do it," and they did. By 1943, nearly 1 in every 3 defense workers was a woman. They mastered engineering, mechanics, and logistics, once thought too complex for them. Without their hands, no bomber would have left American soil. And it wasn't just factories. Women took to the skies themselves. The WASP, Women Air Force Service Pilots, ferried new aircraft across the country, often flying without radios, weapons, or recognition. They tested damaged planes, towed targets for gunnery practice, and sometimes paid the ultimate price. They never saw combat, yet without them, combat could not have existed. For every B-17 that thundered across the Atlantic, for every pilot who made it home, there was a woman behind it, tightening the bolts, sewing the parachutes, fueling the dream. They proved that courage was not limited by gender, that victory depended not only on those who fought, but on those who built the wings of freedom itself.
By 1943, the numbers no longer seemed real. What once took months now took hours. America had become a machine, a living factory dedicated to one purpose: to fill the skies with bombers. At Boeing's Plant 2 in Seattle, the assembly lines never slept. Engines thundered day and night. Riveters worked beneath the glow of arc lamps, sparks raining like stars. Each station built a single piece, a wing, a tail, a nose, and by the time the line ended, a full B-17 flying fortress stood ready for flight. 1 every hour, 60 in a day, nearly 2,000 a month. Across the nation, other plants followed the same rhythm. Douglas in California, Lockheed in Georgia, Ford's massive Willow Run plant in Michigan, a factory so vast it had its own airport. There, the dream of a bomber every hour became a stunning reality. The process was a symphony of motion. Trains brought in engines from Pratt & Whitney. Convoys delivered aluminum from Pittsburgh. Women lined the belts. Men operated cranes, and inspectors checked every rivet, every wire, every seal. It was more than production. It was pride. Each worker knew that somewhere across the sea, 10 young men would trust their lives to what they built. Every bolt was tightened as if their own son would fly inside that plane. Soon, the assembly lines grew so efficient that brand new fortresses rolled out faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. German intelligence couldn't believe the numbers. They called it an endless swarm. When the first bomber lifted off from Willow Run, a sign hung above the floor: the B-17, built by Americans who know why they build. It was the heartbeat of a nation. Every hour, another fortress rose into the sky, another promise, another hope, another weapon for freedom.
Before the first B-17 ever took to the skies, its designers had one goal: to build an aircraft so tough, so resilient, that it could take punishment no plane had ever survived before. At Boeing's design rooms in Seattle, engineers sketched and argued deep into the night. They didn't just want a bomber that could carry bombs. They wanted one that could carry men home. They started with the frame, a lattice of aluminum alloy, strong yet light, built to bend but never break. Its self-sealing fuel tanks were wrapped in rubber and fabric layers that could close themselves after being hit by bullets. Its redundant systems meant that if one hydraulic line failed, another took its place. If one engine caught fire, the other three could keep the fortress flying. The cockpit layout was simple, intuitive, designed for tired men in chaos, making split-second decisions. And all around them, guns. From nose to tail, 12 heavy 50 caliber Browning machine guns turned the B-17 into a flying fortress in more than just name. Each gun position had overlapping fields of fire, no blind spots, no weaknesses. Attack from any angle, and a fortress could answer with a storm of lead. Engineers even designed armor plates around the cockpit, the control cables, and the most vital parts of the fuselage. If the crew couldn't be invincible, their plane would be as close as humanly possible. Then came the most ingenious feature of all: modularity. Every part could be swapped, repaired, or replaced in the field. A B-17 crippled one day could be flying again a week later. Test pilots tried to break it and failed. They cut engines, shot at their own wings, even flew into storms just to see what it could endure. Time and again, the fortress refused to fall. By the time war came, the engineers at Boeing had done something extraordinary. They hadn't just built a bomber, they had built a survivor. And in the years that followed, tens of thousands of airmen would owe their lives to that brilliance, to the men and women who engineered the indestructible fortress.
Wars are not won only by courage. They are won by movement, by the endless tide of fuel, food, bullets, and machines that feed the front. And no war in history had ever demanded as much as the air war over Europe. Behind every mission, behind every bomber that roared into the sky, stood an invisible army. Mechanics, loaders, planners, drivers, and clerks, millions of people whose names would never appear in the headlines. The logistics of the 8th Air Force were staggering. Each B-17 required 1,700 gallons of fuel, 5,000 rounds of ammunition, and 4 tons of bombs before it could even take off. And they were hundreds of them, flying every single day. Convoys stretched across England, carrying everything from machine parts to coffee rations. Fuel trucks rumbled down narrow country roads at night, headlights blacked out against the threat of German bombers. Rail lines carried endless crates marked U.S. Army Air Forces, spare propellers, replacement engines, oxygen tanks, and tires taller than a man. On the bases, mechanics worked without rest. They patched bullet holes with sheet metal, replaced damaged control cables, and tuned engines by ear. Every plane that came home limping was repaired and ready to fly again within days. The ground crews called them their boys, even though they never left the ground. And then there were the bombs. Tons upon tons of them, stored in muddy fields, lifted by cranes, rolled beneath wings, and armed by hand. Each one carried by the sweat of hundreds of unseen workers. The supply chain stretched across oceans, from the factories of Michigan and California to the ports of New York, across the stormy Atlantic, into Liverpool, and finally to the airfields of East Anglia. Every screw, Every drop of fuel, every bullet made that same impossible journey. It was a machine as vast as the sky itself, a web of effort so perfectly timed that bombers never stopped flying. The men in the air fought the visible war, but the men and women on the ground, the ones who loaded the bombs, fueled the tanks, repaired the wings, they fought the unseen war, the one that made everything else possible. Without them, the flying fortress would have been nothing more than metal. With them, it became unstoppable.
It was the mission that changed everything. The day the sky itself seemed to bleed. August 17, 1943. The 8th Air Force was ordered to strike two of the most vital targets in the German war machine. The Messerschmitt factories at Regensburg, where the deadly Bf-109s were born, and the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, without which no tank, no engine, no fighter could move. Two targets, two massive bomber forces, one single terrible plan. The idea was bold and deadly. The Regensburg group would bomb first, then continue south to North Africa. Hours later, the Schweinfurt group would strike and return to England. It was meant to split the German defenses, but timing failed. A delay at the airfields meant the two forces flew hours apart. The Luftwaffe could attack each in turn. At dawn, hundreds of fortresses lifted off from English runways, filling the sky in perfect formation. The first group crossed into Germany, and the ambush began. Fighters swarmed from every direction. Dozens of Bf-109s and FW-190s streaked through the formations, their cannon fire ripping through aluminum. Planes exploded mid-air, engines burned, wings tore apart. Still, the fortresses pressed on, through flak clouds so thick they looked like storm fronts. Bombs dropped true on Regensburg, factories shattered, runways torn apart, but at a terrible cost. Then came Schweinfurt. The second wave faced an even worse hell. For hours, the Luftwaffe tore them apart, attacking in relentless waves. By the time the surviving bombers reached their target, the sky was filled with smoke and fire. They dropped their bombs and turned for home, but home was far away. Many never made it. Some crews ditched in the channel, others vanished into the clouds, never to return. Of the 376 bombers that took off that morning, 60 were lost, and nearly 600 men with them. It was the highest price the 8th Air Force had paid yet. When the survivors landed, their planes looked like floating skeletons, holes big enough to crawl through, engines shredded, faces pale with exhaustion. The mission was a success on paper, but on the ground, everyone knew the truth. They had proven their courage and the terrible cost of flying without escorts. From that day on, Schweinfurt-Regensburg became known by a single name among the airmen who lived it: the Blood Red Mission. The skies over Europe were a death trap. German fighters attacked from every direction, firing cannon shells that tore through aluminum and flesh alike. Something had to change. The answer came not from a new weapon, but from formation. Engineers and tacticians studied every air battle, every loss, every fragment of wreckage. They realized the B-17's true power wasn't just in its guns, but in how those guns could work together. Thus was born the combat box formation, a masterpiece of geometry in motion. Each B-17, bristling with machine guns, took its place like a single piece of armor in a vast flying fortress wall. 3 planes formed a V. 3 Vs made a squadron. 3 squadrons made a group, a living machine of metal, discipline, and trust. From the ground, it looked like a cathedral of war drifting across the sky. From the cockpit, it was a storm of roaring engines, turbulence, and courage. Every gun covered the blind spots of another. Tail gunners shielded the next formation. Top turrets swept the skies above. Side gunners crossed their fire through the air like invisible threads of protection. When the Luftwaffe attacked, they faced not single bombers, but a fortress of hundreds, each defending the other with unrelenting fire. Fighter pilots described it as flying into a wall of lead. Even the boldest Germans hesitated. But inside the formation, it was no less dangerous. One wrong move, one mistake, and wings could collide. Bombers brushed wingtips at 300 miles per hour, just feet apart, holding perfect formation under fire. The men trusted not only their own skill, but the unbreakable discipline of the crew beside them. Every mission became a ballet of death and precision. The combat box wasn't just a formation, it was the beating heart of the bomber offensive, a shield of courage that allowed the Allies to take the war deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. They didn't fly alone anymore. They flew as one.
For years, the bombers had fought alone. They had braved the skies of Europe with courage, but courage wasn't enough. Every raid into Germany was a gamble, and too many never came back. The problem was distance. Fighter escorts could protect them only part of the way. Once the bombers crossed deep into enemy territory, the fighters had to turn back, leaving the fortresses to face the Luftwaffe alone. Germany ruled those skies. Until the Mustang arrived. It began as a British request, a fast, agile fighter to replace aging designs. What rolled out of North American Aviation's factory was sleek, sharp, and full of potential. But it was when engineers fitted it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that the legend was born. Suddenly, the P-51 Mustang could fly higher, faster, and most importantly, farther than any Allied fighter before it. It could reach Berlin and come back. The bomber crews had a saying, "When the Mustangs showed up, we knew we were going home." They were fast enough to chase down 109s and FW-190s. Their range let them ride shotgun all the way to the target and back. And their beauty, a long nose, polished metal, the hum of the Merlin, became the very image of victory. The Luftwaffe pilots were stunned. They were used to watching the bombers burn. Now, when they dived in for the kill, silver streaks dropped out of the sun, and the hunters became the hunted. Mustang pilots tore through German formations, protecting the fortresses with almost reckless devotion. They dive through flak, chase enemy fighters miles away, and circle back to guide the bombers home. In the air war over Europe, everything changed. The days of unescorted raids were over. The bombers were no longer alone in the sky. The Mustang had come. And with it, the balance of power shifted forever. By early 1944, the Allies had a weapon for every challenge. The indestructible B-17 Flying Fortress, and now its guardian angel, the P-51 Mustang. It was time to strike a blow so massive that the Luftwaffe itself would break. They called it Operation Argument. The airmen would remember it by another name, Big Week. For 7 relentless days in February 1944, the skies over Germany became a furnace of metal and flame. From the frozen fields of England, hundreds upon hundreds of bombers took off each morning, B-17s and B-24s thundering through gray skies toward the heart of the Reich. Their targets? The factories that built Germany's planes, engines, and weapons, the lifeblood of Hitler's Air Force. Regensburg, Augsburg, Leipzig, Stuttgart, Brunswick. Every name became a battlefield. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the air. Me-109s, FW-190s, even the rare twin-engine fighters and rocket planes joined the hunt. Dogfights erupted at 25,000 feet.
swirling chaos where silver bombers and dark fighters clashed in fire and smoke. But this time, the bombers weren't alone. The Mustangs were there, diving, rolling, streaking through the sky, cutting down the Luftwaffe before it could reach the formations. Every day, fewer German fighters returned to base. Every day, the Allies pushed deeper into the sky once thought untouchable. The cost was brutal. Hundreds of planes lost, thousands of airmen killed or captured. But the mission was clear: destroy the German Air Force before the invasion of Europe. By the end of the week, the factories were in ruins. The Luftwaffe was bleeding. Its best pilots were gone. Its confidence shattered. For the first time in the war, the bombers could fly to Germany and back with a real chance of survival. The air over Europe no longer belonged to the Reich. It belonged to the Fortress and to the Mustang. Big Week had turned the sky black with smoke, but when the smoke cleared, the dawn of Allied air supremacy had begun.
By the spring of 1944, the unthinkable had become reality. The flying fortresses were no longer struggling to reach Germany. They were flying straight for its heart, Berlin. For years, the city had been untouchable, a symbol of Nazi power, a fortress of steel and propaganda. Hitler boasted that no enemy would ever dare strike the German capital from the air. But the day came when the hum of thousands of engines answered that boast. From bases across England, hundreds of B-17s lifted into the dawn sky, their wings stretching from horizon to horizon. Each carried the weight of history and the promise of revenge for every fallen crew before them. As they crossed the channel, radio silence fell. No one spoke. Only the steady heartbeat of engines filled the air. Then, on the horizon, the flak towers of Berlin appeared, monuments of concrete and steel spitting black smoke and fire. The city erupted. Anti-aircraft guns pounded the heavens, filling the sky with bursts of death. The Luftwaffe, desperate and furious, scrambled everything it had left. The bombers flew straight into hell. But the Mustangs were waiting for them. Diving through the chaos, they tore into the German fighters, turning what should have been a massacre into a deadly ballet of skill and fire. The fortresses pressed on, formation after formation, each one battered, burning, but unbroken. Bomb bay doors opened, and from 25,000 feet, a storm of steel fell upon the capital of the Third Reich. Explosions rolled through the city. Factories, rail yards, and command centers vanished beneath clouds of smoke. Even as flak tore through their wings, the crews held their course. For the first time, Berlin, the heart of Nazi power, was under sustained assault from the air. It wasn't just another mission, it was a message. The message that the war had turned, that the Reich was no longer safe, not even in its own capital. When the surviving bombers returned to England, they came home torn and scarred, but triumphant. The unbreakable promise of the flying fortress had been fulfilled. They had flown over Berlin, and they had come back.
Victory has a sound. The thunder of engines, the whistle of bombs, the cheers of those who survived. But victory also has a silence, the silence left behind by those who never returned. By 1945, the Flying Fortress had helped break the back of Nazi Germany. Cities that once glowed with industry now lay in ruins. The Luftwaffe was shattered. The skies belonged to the Allies. But every mile of that sky had been paid for in blood. Of all the airmen who flew with the 8th Air Force, more than 26,000 never came home. Tens of thousands more were wounded, burned, or captured. Entire crews vanished into the clouds, leaving only smoke and silence where courage had once lived. For the men who survived, victory was never simple. They came back changed, haunted by the empty seats beside them, by the faces of friends frozen in memory. Each mission had been a coin toss between life and death, and yet they climbed into their fortresses again and again, not for glory, but for the belief that ending the war was worth the risk. They were young, many barely out of school, but they carried the weight of nations on their shoulders. The ground crews, too, bore the cost, watching the planes they tended vanish over the horizon, praying to see them return. Some didn't, and when a fortress limped back alone, its landing gear crushed, its crews silent, the victory felt hollow. When the war finally ended, Europe was free. The mission was complete, but the price was carved into history, into crosses on quiet fields, into names on walls, into the hearts of those who survived. The Flying Fortress had done its duty. It had changed the course of the war, but it had also changed the men who flew it, forever. The cost of victory wasn't measured in bombs dropped, but in the lives that lifted them into the sky.
As the war dragged into its final, brutal year, the skies over Germany burned brighter than ever before. The Flying Fortress, once a symbol of defiance, had become an instrument of total destruction. By 1945, the Allied bombing campaign was no longer about single targets. It was about breaking the will of an empire built on tyranny. The factories, the railways, the cities, nothing was beyond reach. And from the clouds came the storm. Night after night, day after day, waves of B-17s filled the sky, their silver wings glinting in the light of 1,000 fires below. Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, the names became synonymous with the inferno. When the bombs fell, entire districts disappeared beneath a curtain of flame. Winds howled through the cities, firestorms so fierce they sucked the air from the lungs of those who ran for shelter. For the airmen above, it was impossible to ignore. From 25,000 feet, they could see the fire spreading, rolling across rooftops like a living thing. They had done what they were sent to do, but the sight haunted them. Many never spoke of it again. To some, the fortress was a savior, the weapon that ended a monstrous regime. To others, it was a reminder of what war becomes when victory demands everything. The line between strategy and devastation blurred in the smoke. But one truth remained. Without the Flying Fortress, the war might have dragged on, costing millions more lives on the ground. As the last missions ended and the fires cooled, Europe was left scarred, its cities broken, its people changed forever. The fortress had done its duty, and the fire it unleashed had burned away the last shadow of the Reich. But even in victory, the men who flew those missions carried a question that never left them. How much destruction is too much, even for peace?
When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world was divided, but it was also connected by the shared wreckage of war. The same skies that once burned with hatred were now filled with a new kind of purpose. The men who had fought each other, the pilots, the engineers, the dreamers on both sides, would soon find themselves building the future together. Many German engineers, once part of the Luftwaffe's war machine, were taken to work for the Allies under Operation Paperclip and other secret programs. Their expertise in jet propulsion, aerodynamics, and rocketry was unmatched. These were the minds that had designed the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, a weapon born too late to change the outcome of the war, but advanced enough to change the future of flight. Now, instead of designing weapons to destroy cities, they were helping build the machines that would reach the stars. American and German scientists, once enemies, stood side by side, designing faster jets, stronger engines, and rockets that would one day pierce the atmosphere. The rivalry of destruction became a race of discovery. And the irony was not lost on those who had lived through it. The same technology that once filled the sky with death would soon carry humans beyond it. Some former Luftwaffe pilots even joined post-war aviation programs, teaching the very tactics that had once been used against the flying fortresses. They studied what had defeated them and turned it into knowledge. The world had entered a new era. The fortress was gone, but its legacy of engineering, courage, and cooperation lived on. In a world rebuilding from ashes, enemies became colleagues. Rivals became innovators, and the sky, once a battlefield, became humanity's shared frontier once again.
When the war ended, the world moved on. But the men who flew the flying fortress carried the war within them. They had stared death in the face at 20,000 feet and somehow lived to tell the story. For the survivors of the sky, peace was not quiet. It was strange, unfamiliar. The roar of engines was replaced by the hum of everyday life, a sound that felt too small after the thunder of war. They came home as heroes, but most didn't see themselves that way. They carried memories of friends who hadn't returned, of bombers that vanished into clouds and never came back. Many spoke little of what they'd seen. Some couldn't sleep through storms. The rumble of thunder sounded too much like flak. Others found solace only in the company of those who had been there too, men who understood the language of loss and courage without words. The fortresses that survived were dismantled. Their aluminum melted down to make peaceful things, cars, tools, bridges, even toys. But to those who flew them, the planes were alive. Each one had a soul, and saying goodbye felt like losing another comrade. A few fortresses escaped the scrapyard. They became monuments, silent reminders of a time when the world was on fire and courage had wings. At air shows decades later, the old men who once filled those bomb bays and gun turrets would stand beneath the silver giants again, their hands trembling on the cold metal. They'd whisper to the plane as if it could hear them, and maybe, in some way, it could. Because though the fortresses have grown old, their spirit still soars. In every plane that rises into the blue, in every pilot who looks to the sky and feels something ancient stir. They were called the greatest generation, but to themselves, they were just survivors, survivors of the sky.
In the beginning, the Nazi commanders laughed. They mocked the idea that a nation across the ocean could ever challenge the might of the Luftwaffe. They called the B-17 a toy, too slow, too heavy, too fragile. They said no plane could cross the continent, drop its bombs, and return alive. But they didn't understand what they were truly facing. They weren't facing machines. They were facing men. Men who believed in something bigger than themselves. Men who climbed into silver fortresses and flew into storms of steel, not because they had to, but because someone had to. At first, the Luftwaffe ruled the skies. Their fighters cut through bomber formations like knives through paper. Every mission was a massacre, every return flight a prayer. And still, the fortresses came. More every week, more every month, until the horizon itself filled with their wings. What began as a handful of bombers became an armada of thunder. 1,000 planes, engines roaring in unison, a sky of silver shadows stretching from horizon to horizon. The laughter in Berlin stopped. German officers stood on rooftops and stared upward as the daylight dimmed beneath a mass of bombers overhead. The sky, once their kingdom, had turned black. Every village, every factory, every airfield beneath that endless roar knew that the war had changed. The hunters had become the hunted. The empire that had mocked the fortress in the sky was now watching its cities burn. And above it all, the B-17s flew steady, unbroken, unstoppable. They had fulfilled the impossible dream, a fortress in the sky that no enemy could defeat. When the war finally ended, the world remembered their power, their cost, and their courage. The laughter had long since died. What remained was silence, and the echo of engines fading into history. The flying fortress had done what no one believed it could. It had filled the sky, and it had changed the world forever.